Ruth Jean Randall. It was originally Ruth Jean White, was my maiden name, and I was born 76 years ago, in August the 9th, 1925, in a little country town called Brandon. It was a little farm town, very, very small. And I was born in the same room of a beautiful old home where my father was born 23 years earlier. And it was a hot August day in the middle of Texas.
Where's Brandon?
It's about 30 miles south of Dallas, near Hillsboro, which is still a town.
How long had your family lived there?
You know, I don't know. I think just a few, because I was only born a year after they were married, so they probably had only been there a short time.
Okay.
But they both were from Hillsboro, which was 10 miles away, and the families were there. My mother's family and also my father's family always lived in Hillsboro, which is...
What was your dad doing for work?
I think that he was probably with farming. His father owned quite a few farms in the area. He also owned cotton gin and the bank in Hillsboro. He was fairly well-to-do. And so he probably worked for my grandfather at that time. And Mother, of course, was only 19 and didn't, or she was 20, I guess, when I came.
Right.
So she wasn't, she'd only had 1 year of college at Baylor Belton, which is a college for women. So we've stayed there until, of course, I have no memory of any of this. I just know then that finally we were in Corpus Christi, Texas, was my first memories of being in kindergarten. And then the Depression was setting in, and we moved back near Hillsboro at a farm called in Cleburne, which my grandfather owned. And my father worked that 50-acre farm and then was manager of the cotton gin in Cleburne during the cotton seasons.
What year is that?
That would have been in 30 to about 36. So it was pretty much in the height of the Depression. And we had very little money, but we had a lot of food because of living on the farm. We had chickens and we had cow for milk, and we had 2 horses, of course, that did all the work of the farm. Old Jim, who was an old sway-backed horse, and Nell, who was a beautiful mare. And I used to ride Nell around the barnyard at that time, bareback, because we couldn't afford a saddle. And I do remember when we took old Jim, and he's real swayback, and he had a long, long back. He was so tall. And we brought him up into the porte-cochere where we could stand up on the railing in the porte-cochere, and we took the 3 bed pillows, and my 2 cousins and I straddled old Jim sitting on these 3 pillows. I was about 10, and my cousin was one younger, around 6, and the other one was older, about 13. And it was real hot. They were visiting on a summer afternoon there. And we were going to ride old Jim down this dirt country road. And I had a little pink parasol that was made out of cheap rayon, made in China. And so you can vision this picture of these 3 little girls sitting on 3 bed pillows on this old swayback mule horse. And we were riding down the dirt road with the little pink parasol. And I was guiding. And so Jane held the parasol, and as the horse started to move, when I said giddy up, Jane, my little 6-year-old cousin, said, "He's moving, he's moving."
Stay on it?
So we all stayed on. He plodded slowly, slowly down the road, turned around, came back. That probably took 30 minutes.
When you were on the farm, was their extended family, or was...
Just grandmother, my mother's mother, came to live with us because she was widowed and had no place to go, and there was no place for, there was no Social Security, So she was dependent on her children to
What was her
give her
name?
home. Laura Martin, Laura Tennessee Martin. She was born near Brandon also, and her father had a farm there. Her name was Rogers. And she remembers how the comedian Will Rogers came down to visit them in her home when she was there to talk to her father, spent the day, because he was doing genealogy and had found that my grandmother's family was related to him. So we're related to Will Rogers. Grandmother said that's why we all have such a good sense of humor.
There you go. Was your family, do you know how long they were in Texas? Did they come from somewhere else before they were in Texas?
A little bit about that, not too much. We know that on my father's side that his mother's name was Ferguson, and her father came from Scotland, Bob Ferguson. And he came by himself when he was 19, and he went first to South America and was going to try to make a killing down there as a young man, and he gave up and took a ship back to land in New Orleans, and all he had was 3 monkeys at that time, and he sold the monkeys one at a time for his food. And then he finally, though, got to northern Texas and was ranching as a young man, and then he made, I think it was either 2 or 3 trips on the Chisholm Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, to the 49 Gold Rush, and came to California as a scout, a guide, several times. But he finally ended up owning a large horse ranch in New Mexico and in Texas. And that was Bob Ferguson.
Great.
And we don't know much about the Whites, Luther White, my grandfather on my father's side, other than we think they came from Georgia, but we're not sure about anything from there. But on my grandfather, Robert Martin, who is my grandfather that Laura Tennessee married, his family we've traced all the way back to ancient Scotland, to Robert the Bruce, and we were related to the King Edward of one of the early Scotch kings. So they have a pretty clear family tree all the way back to there, which is very Scotch and English, and Irish. There's a lot of Irish in it too, as many of the Scotch went to Ireland. I was an only child for a long time because my sister wasn't born until I was 9 years old, and that's Laura Doris. We call her Dee. And she was born on the farm in the front bedroom, and the doctor came out and delivered the baby, the family doctor. Mother stayed home the whole time. That was the way it was done then. And I was born the same way. I was in a bedroom at home, and no hospitals. I guess there were hospitals, but we didn't go to them. And I remember how living on the farm, we didn't have electricity until Franklin Roosevelt, the president, finally got the Congress to vote in rural electrification. And that didn't come until the late 30s, as I remember, because we were several years where we had light from kerosene lamps that I read by. At night we had, what we called Aladdin lamps, that they were a little bit brighter, but they were still fueled by kerosene. And we had heat was with the old wood stove in the one room where we called our bedroom, that we called our family room. The house we lived in had 2 bedrooms, living room, dining room, kitchen, and 1 bath. And then it had a big sleeping porch across the back where there were 3 double beds. And that's where you slept in the summertime, which was hotter than Hades in the middle of Texas. So we had, and then they had a big wraparound porch on 2 sides of the house that you could sit out on the porch at any time. But we had kerosene stove to cook by, which I used to take the gallon jug and walk about half a mile to the filling station down the road to get the gallon of kerosene and bring it back home. And we baked with that too. It fueled an oven. We had an ice box for a refrigerator, so we had ice delivered. And then we also had a screened-in window that had a built-out little projection that was where we kept things to keep them cool in the wintertime. It was outside, except it was all screened in. So you put things out there that you didn't want to freeze, but it would keep them cool most of the year, except in the summer.
And it was just out the window?
Uh-huh. You opened the window, and it was a shelf built out, that, and then there was a screening all over it. Yeah, it was fully screened. But that was the cooler outside.
Were there neighbors nearby, or was it?
Not too near. It was like, I guess, a city block was a neighbor who was fairly well-to-do, the Dietrichs, that had a big 2-story home. He was a jeweler in town, a little couple with no children. And then another farmhouse about another city block away. So I didn't really have any friends. The friends I had were all in town, which was a mile back into Cleburne. And we had a Model A, which we could transport ourselves around in, but we didn't. We did a lot of walking.
And how many acres was it?
It was 50 acres, which is very small. That's not big at all. But we grew corn and cotton. I remember chopping corn, not because I had to. It was just because it was kind of fun to do for half a day, and then you'd quit.
Did you have farm hands?
We had a hired hand that lived on the farm, he and his wife, and we paid him $1 a day for a full day's work. And of course, we supplied him with his place to live, which was a fairly nice little 2-bedroom place with a kitchen. And he had all the eggs and milk he needed, and all the fruit. We had lots of fruit trees and big garden and a lot of chickens, so that there was always plenty of food. And Mother canned so much food. In the summer, we had a closet that was just floor to ceiling. I think something like one year I remember 250 jars of food, vegetables and fruit and everything you can imagine was canned. And I did a lot of the helping with that, the peeling and washing, and would work all day in the kitchen when I was young doing that. And let's see, we had, as I said, no money really, but when I wanted to go to the movies, which was a walk of 1 mile to town, in the summertime I used to go out and gather up 12 eggs in a basket, and on the way to the movie place I would stop at the ranch store where they sold eggs, and they'd give me 10 cents for that dozen eggs, and I'd take that 10 cents and go give it to the movie place, and I got to see the old cowboy movies with the Perils of Pauline as the short subjects in the cartoon for a dime.
And how big was the town?
Just a few thousand. I'd say maybe not more than 5,000 people, roughly, as I remember. It was small. But it had a little courthouse. You know, every town had its own little courthouse in the center of town, which was the plaza. And that's where the farmers brought their goods to trade on the weekend for the farmers market.
So you had cows?
Yes. And the farmhand, we asked him, his name was Jim, and he always sent his little bitty wife out to milk the cows every morning at 5 o'clock real early, and he stayed in bed in the cabin. And Mother said, Jim, why don't you go out and milk those cows? And he said, well, Ms. White, I just never learned how. And so from then on, that became one of our family sayings. Anything we didn't want to do, I just never learned how. And we had a telephone, you know, that was the old ring kind, and party line, and I think our ring was 3 long rings, and we'd pick up the phone if it was 3 long rings. And then other people had different rings. One would have just 4 rings, or a long and a short. And so you weren't supposed to pick up the phone and listen in, but everybody did. So you were pretty sure you had 4 other people listening to your conversation, because life was pretty boring. And if somebody got a phone call, that's pretty interesting. So we had, that was our phone service. And then finally, of course, we got electrification, which was wonderful. And every fall was hog killing time. And that's when you slaughtered a couple of hogs, and you got, we had black people that lived about a mile away up on Oak Hill. And so they would always come down, and we'd pay them to help slaughter the hogs and butcher them. And then they would, the great big fat lady, a black woman that did our washing once every Monday, she would render all that fat in a great big black kettle on open fire and out in the backyard. So they'd render the fat to get lard, and then also would use it to make lye soap to do the washing. That was the only soap you had. And then that was made in those great big kettles and then put into big pans to harden, and you just cut it up. And it would just eat the skin right off of you. It was so strong. So you had to be very careful. Soap was made with, it's glycerin and fat and I don't know just what else the formula was for making soap. And you didn't even know that. And she used to come every Monday and do the washing, putting it all in this big black kettle on an open fire out there. It was a huge, pot. Yeah. And she'd use a big old broomstick to lift the clothes up and down, and then would put them over into another big pot to rinse, and then hand squeeze them and put them on a line. Sheets and towels and all the family clothing. So after living on the farm through the 30s there, early 30s, then when I was in 7th grade, we moved to Taft, Texas, which is a town of about 2,000 people near the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, about 18 miles north of Corpus Christi. And it was a little bitty town, and my father was called down there to be a foreman for a cotton gin and a cottonseed mill. So it was a year-round job. And we had a company housing to live in, which was very comfortable, but austere, right near the cottonseed mill. And of course, everything was so close there because with 2,000 people, I think the school was about a half a mile away that I went to, where I rode my bike from, and I was there from 7th grade till I graduated from high school in 1942, and that was after the war had begun. So I had, a little bit about high school, I guess. I was always very popular. I had real close friends in a very close-knit community. There were 32 in my graduating class, and about half of those were Mexican. So the rest of us were all the gang and stuck together, and also the class in front of us was we were close to them. So we had a group of maybe 20 kids that used to have the luxury of going every Saturday night to what we called the shack. It was a little building, like a big living room fireplace with a little kitchen and dinette that one of the richer families in town had built for their 2 high school children to entertain themselves. It would be like a big family room today, except it wasn't attached to their house. And the mother would always come with her knitting, and she'd sit in the corner and knit all the time we were all there. We were never alone, always chaperoned. But we had a great time. We had record players, and we just danced and played games, and so that was kind of a meeting place for all of us, and it made us all grow quite close together. But it was interesting how we still had dates, and you would have a date to go to the shack. And I dated quite a few guys. Didn't have any real favorites, just enjoyed being with a lot of them. And we had football games, of course, we went to, and I was a drum majorette. There were 2 of us that twirled the baton in front of the band. I never could play any instruments, so I never got in the band. All my other friends were in the band. And it was just a small town experience of going to school, and we went. We only had 11 grades. We didn't have 12 grades like you do now. So I graduated when I was 16 and went off to Baylor University. And I was second highest in my graduating class, so I got a full scholarship to a private school, a Baptist school called Baylor, which is still operating today in Waco, Texas. And I went there for a year and discovered they didn't have a very good home economics department, so I transferred to Texas. And by that time, Mother was teaching full-time, so she was able to help me, and I didn't have to work. But I did go to school continuously because it was wartime. There was nothing else to do. There were no men on campus except the ones that couldn't get in the service because of any problems they had. So we never dated, even though we were in a sorority and had, wonderful opportunities. There was just nobody around, and they were all so young, younger than I was by the time I was junior and senior in college. So I graduated from college in 3 years and 2 months, and graduated with honors with home economics as a teacher. And 3 days after I graduated, I married my wonderful husband, Bob Randall. And he had just returned 30 days before from serving, being sent to Europe at the end of World War II. And we can talk more about Bob later, but he had been in the service, and he had completed his all but about 3 units of his college education when he was drafted back in 1943. And he was able to complete the college by, correspondence in the Army. In fact, even on our honeymoon, he was working on a paper he had to get turned in at a certain time to finish his degree. So it was very important that we get our degrees at that time. And I think we instilled that in all our children, that they had to get their degree no matter what.
He was a famous trumpet man from out Chicago way. He had a boogie style that no one else could play. He was a top man at his craft. But then his number came up and he was gone with the draft. He's in the Army now, a blowing reveille.
At my first date, of course, I didn't go out with him. He called the sorority house and asked if there was anybody there that would like to go to the officers' club to dance in town in Austin at the hotel, or if there were 2 of them, because he and his fellow officer wanted dates. And he said, "I'm a Kappa Sig from UCLA," and so I'm calling the Delta Gamma house to see if there's 2 girls that would like to go. So my friend and I said we would go. I went out with his friend, and she was with Bob. And we danced away the night, and then the next morning, Sunday morning, he called me and said he had to go back to the camp, the Army camp, at 6 that evening, but could he stop by in the afternoon and we could go out for a Coke? So I said yes, and so I sat around waiting all afternoon. I didn't wait, I was studying because I had so much studying to do, but finally I thought, well, he's not coming. It didn't even bother me because it was no big deal. I really didn't know him anyway. And so finally I had changed my clothes and gotten in my jeans to keep on studying, and the doorbell rang, and I was alone at the house at that time. The other girls had gone out. And so I started down the stairs, and in came this officer's hat flying up the stairs. He had thrown it in. And of course that was his way of saying, if you don't throw the hat back out, I'll be welcome to come in.
Right.
So I picked it up and welcomed him in and didn't really care. And what had happened, and as I learned later on with him, that he had fallen asleep. And when he falls asleep in the afternoon, nobody can wake him up. And he never does sleep in the afternoon. So that was his excuse anyway, that he had fallen asleep. And then I saw him the next weekend when he came in from camp. We had started going together, and I'd see him every weekend after that. So, by Christmas, that was in early November, and when I took him home with me to Corpus Christi for Christmas, he gave me his fraternity pin and just told me that his intentions were honorable, that he wasn't asking me to marry him. And it wasn't until then in April, just before he was to go overseas to Europe, that he gave me an engagement ring and asked me to marry him. So that was kind of, but college I don't remember with a great deal of fun, because it was just a lot of hard work of going to school and just getting through it. Though I enjoyed living in the sorority house, and I always roomed with my old friend from high school, Dorothy. And Dorothy and Ann and I in high school were called the Three Musketeers. We were from 7th grade on, we were inseparable. And it's been that way the rest of our lives. Now in our latter years, we see each other once a year and have a reunion. So it's a friendship that's lasted over 60 some odd years, over 60 years. So now we got into college with nothing real memorable to tell.
So now you're engaged.
Uh-huh.
And Dad went off.
He went to Europe and got there just a few days when VE Day was declared, so he didn't have any fighting to do. And they were shipping him then to Marseille, France, and he was to catch a boat, go through the Mediterranean Suez Canal, and heading for Japan to finish up the fighting over there. He was a lieutenant in charge of in the engineering corps, and they built pontoon bridges. So they were in front of the infantry in any invasion, because they had to build a bridge so the infantry could cross over and fight. And the fatality rate on lieutenants in the engineer corps in the bridge building was the highest in the whole service, because those men really had a struggle trying to build and shoot and keep from getting shot. And they were kind of floating pontoon bridges. And Bob was very good in math, so he got in the engineer corps very quickly. They grabbed him for that because and put him through officers training, which they call 90-day wonders. And they tried to break them in 90 days, and they did. More than half of them never could make it through the 90 days. It was so torturous.
Physical or mental?
Physical, mental, emotional, everything they could plow onto you. Lack of sleep, tremendous pressure mentally and in school, and then physical, just tried to wear them out totally in calisthenics, and it was a killer. And so it was pretty hard to make that 90-day wonder, but at the end of it you got your bars and you were an officer, which if you were in the infantry or the engineer corps was kind of scary because the fatalities were so high because you were on the front lines.
And being an officer meant that
you were right there with
you were the target.
Yeah,
of the enemy.
that's right. I guess. And of course, a lot of the men got killed too. I mean, the regular soldiers. But fortunately, he was just at the end of all of that. And then VJ Day came when his ship had not yet gone through the Suez Canal, so they were radioed and told to turn around and head for Boston, which was a big surprise when he called me from Boston. See, I had no idea where he was, thought he was heading to Japan. And I went to the phone at the sorority house there, and he said, "Hi, this is Bob." And I said, "Bob who?" And he said, "I started to hang up and just forget the whole thing." But then he took a 30-day leave to go home, and then came back and spent the rest of his leave waiting for me to graduate. And that was when I did graduate in the October 24th, and we were married on the 27th. Well, he was born in Whittier, and he was born in a hospital here in Whittier. Hospital, they had a small, more like a home rather than a hospital, but they did go there. And he was born on New Year's Eve, December 31st in 1920. He was born 5 years earlier than I was. And his folks were very poor. They had a small little 2-bedroom bungalow on Ramona Drive in Whittier. His mother stayed home, and his father worked in the orange groves out at Leffingwell Ranch, which when it was functioning and all the orange groves were in full bloom, he did the pruning and I don't know what, all kinds of things for bringing the oranges to the packing houses. That finally, of course, became more and more obsolete. The orange groves disappeared. And he spent then many years as the head gardener for the city of Whittier and took care of most of the parks. And so he was always outdoors. He was always gardening. He loved gardening. And he knew every tree and shrub and knew how just to prune them just right. So he had a crew of men that worked the city of Whittier for many years. And finally, his mother did, after Bob was gone and was way in college, she went to work as a secretary and treasurer for Daniel's Tire Service, which was quite a little business here in Whittier. That she was kind of the head office person. She was very intelligent and real good in math, and it was self-taught. She didn't have any college education.
Her name?
Helen Kiger, and she married Louis Sherman Randall. They were both from Kansas City, Missouri. They both grew up in Kansas City. And Louis came out here, and Helen, because Louis's father, which was Will Randall, had been quite ill in Kansas City and wasn't given very long to live, so the doctors told him to come to California and it might help his health. And so he came out here when he was about 57, 55, somewhere in there, and he lived to be 100. So it helped his health. And he had a small orange ranch, and he also later on developed a little savings and loan business in Whittier. And he got his own law degree in Kansas City as, I don't know what that meant. He taught himself, but he got some kind of a certificate of where you read for the law and pass some exams, I guess. And this was, many, many years ago. So he was a very smart man, very kind. They both were just wonderful people. Bob went to school all those years here in Whittier, never moved from that same home, which is unusual. And the home has been sold now, so it's no longer in the family, but it's still there. Let's see, he went to junior college in Fullerton for 2 years, Fullerton JC, and then he transferred to UCLA where he got his business degree, and with a specialty in advertising was his degree. In high school, he was editor of the paper. He was center for the football team, and they won a lot of CIF things, and he just got clobbered every time because he was so small, and in the center they just run right over him. So, but he was on the team. And that, I think that's about, what else do you think of for of interest?
Didn't he have, I thought there was some house on La Corta that, I remember he had a big scar on his arm that he said he got by getting his hand cut or arm cut on the glass, and
it could have been the uncles. There were two uncles that had houses on La Corta and had orange groves out there. Okay. I can't remember even their names, but yeah. It might have been that was where it happened, but there were relatives all around. Even Granddaddy Will Randall's brother John followed him out and had a nice big orange ranch in La Habra for many years. So
then he went to UCLA?
yes, and he joined Kappa Sig there, and he had to work his way through. He had to help pay. His folks could not pay for any of his college at all. So he was full